Hey, everybody, I'm Alex Cohen.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And welcome. Thank you for joining us here on the latest edition of the Inside the Issues podcast. There is, once again, I feel like we're always saying this, and it's always true, so much going on in the world, and a lot of it's really difficult. And we're going to just try to take a moment and mull it all over. First and foremost, the situation in the Middle East. We'll talk about that and how it's affecting a lot right here in Southern California.
That's right. And the big news this past week beyond the geopolitical has been the 1-year anniversary of those leaked recordings. We'll discuss what has been the impact of those recordings here in LA.
And despite all of this stuff that's going on, we also have news in terms of the race for the White House. A very important Californian candidate in this race, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., deciding to run as an independent. We'll look at what that might do to this contest. But first, Sarah, this situation in the Middle East, you know, on the one hand, so far away from Southern California, and yet it also feels, at least to me, really close in all sorts of ways.
It definitely does. And most certainly we have seen local leaders, politicians, activists, all having strong reactions or silence on these issues as well. And I think we see this causing ripple effects throughout the politics of Southern California in some new and interesting ways that we haven't necessarily seen in the past.
Yeah. And I think this is actually one of those weeks where it might be good to jump into our regular segment, What's the Word? Because this touches all of it. What's the word?
Combust.
Yeah, or maybe combustible.
Or combustible,
combustion.
yes.
Right.
All of the versions.
All of the versions, which is interesting, Sarah, just for, like, I always think of combustible as, like, easily catching fire, and I think that would count as a definition. But I was like, if we're going to go all Merriam-Webster about it, is to excite easily.
Yeah.
And I think that's what has been going on here. You mentioned what people have been saying and what they haven't been saying. So shortly after we saw the violence erupt in the Middle East over the past few days, the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, a large political association that has backed a number of candidates.
And has been successful in getting a new crop of politicians specifically in LA City Council.
Yeah. So these were the folks, DSA LA, the local chapter supported Nithya Raman the first time she was elected, an unseated David Ryu, you might remember back in the day, so an outsider coming in. They have endorsed her once again for the upcoming election. They have endorsed, they did endorse Eunices Hernandez and Hugo Soto Martinez, again, two outsiders who at first, I think there was some question of, like, Hugo Soto Martinez going up against Mitch O'Farrell, and of course a lot of things happened, or Eunices Hernandez going up against Gil Cedillo. Right. But, I don't think you could say the DSA endorsement was the be-all, end-all, but it was significant.
It was very significant and really brought forth this new brand of politics in Los Angeles that has certainly been at odds with kind of the Democratic establishment of Los Angeles politics.
Yes. So violence erupts once again in the Middle East. We see this flurry online of sentiments of various politicians and organizations saying, I stand firmly with Israel. And DSA said very loudly, very clearly that they are standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people because of what has long happened in that part of the world, talking about the Israeli-led apartheid in that state. DSA, LA, rejited it or whatever we're calling it these days, saying, like, in case you missed it, you know, kind of saying, hey, and we're standing with them. And so a lot of people jumped on social media and kind of put the two and two together and combusted, right? Like, okay, DSA, you're saying something that we don't necessarily agree with. And Nithya and Hugo and Eunices, you were endorsed by these folks. So what do you say to this?
Right. What do you say to this? And I think particularly in the case of Nithya Raman, what do you say to this when you have a large proportion of the Jewish population in your district? Because not only are these statements saying that we stand with Palestine and that we condone essentially this attack from Hamas on Israeli people. And let us not forget, some of the images have been gruesome of babies being murdered in their cribs, of American citizens being killed while hiding in closets in their homes, an entire field of 20-somethings at a music festival where folks using hang gliders, Hamas militants using hang gliders, coming in and massacring hundreds and hundreds of them. So when these kinds of comments come out, and particularly when you have folks from the Jewish community in your district, a large proportion of them, it necessarily does raise the temperature, and absolutely also raises the opportunity and potential for violence against the Jewish community here in Los Angeles. And this is one of the real concerns that I think many within the Jewish community, and of course here in LA, we have the second largest Jewish community outside of Israel, a very, very strong community, a community with a very long history here in Los Angeles, really kind of not just scratching their heads, but absolute outrage at the silence from these three members in particular.
And I want to push back a little bit, because it gets back to that combustible notion. And there's a reason I'm not in politics. I think everyone was wanting that urgency, right? Like things were on fire. DSA says this, DSA LA echoes it. Nithya, what do you say? Ugo, what do you say? Eunices, and there's this, and I think also because of the media climate, which I just want to note too, right? Like I'm a child of the 70s, so I have seen this conflict play out many times. But the difference between it playing out in a world of print newspapers and Walter Cronkite versus TikTok and Instagram, it's just very, very different. And I think that adds a whole layer to it. And so we didn't hear from these electeds for many days. And then on Wednesday, we started to see these statements coming out. And Nithya's, I thought, actually was very interesting because it used it specifically mentioned DSA and said, yes, I was endorsed by them. And yes, I got their support. And yes, I empathize with all people, and I'm going to work to have these dialogues. And I think it's just walking this real difficult line of, who do you stand with and who do you not stand with? And that is super tricky. And then, go ahead.
It is, but I will just add to it. I mean, I think...
And while you're doing this, I'm just going to pull up Nithya's exact statement because I want to get it right.
Sure.
Keep going.
And it was a longer one. And in so many ways, I can very much appreciate the nuance of that statement. I think for me, the real concern that I have is for all three of these politicians, they really had to go back and check in with DSA, check in with how can I say it, when can I say it, will you still support me? I don't know what their conversations were like, but there was this big lag. And it suggests to me that you lack the fortitude as a leader or the moral compass, perhaps, to at least make some sort of statement about the current violence, that there's nothing that can be said. And I certainly appreciate the complexities that exist between Israel and Palestine. For myself, for my own family, most certainly after 9/11, we felt that as well. Anyone who might be perceived as Muslim was a target, was targeted as at the airports, walking down the street. So certainly there's a whole lot of nuance there, but suggesting the silence in this media environment, in which these are some folks that are pretty prolific tweeters and Instagrammers, that silence, it can feel very deafening and most certainly seemed to condone this act of horrific violence against civilians. And I think that's the real key difference. We can take a look at the policies of Israel, the policies of Hamas, and we recognize the difference between Hamas and Palestine, most certainly. And I think that's a much bigger piece. But this aggression, I think, coming out of DSA, it's been also put forward by the Black Lives Matter movement, by the People's City Council, really comes from this perspective, from Friends Fanon. A lot has been talked about colonialism and this notion of by any means necessary.
Right. And just to be clear here, because it's a lot to unpack, that I think what we're seeing now in statements that have come out from Black Lives Matter, that they are standing in in solidarity with Palestine because of what they see as very parallel existences between the Black community and the people of Palestine.
Right. And by any means necessary, suggesting that it's okay to use violence to justify the means that the ends that you are trying to reach.
Right.
And I think becomes a real moral question, I think, for all Americans to ask themselves, to what extent are you okay with that?
Right. And I think that there's a conflating here of causes and methods, right? I see BLM saying we stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine and what they've been through. We agree on the causes. In terms of the methods, it's where things get a little bit, I think, murky and unclear. There was an image that was going out on social media of someone parachuting in, which I think to everyone really strongly, clearly, it's combustible because it evokes that image of Hamas fighters parachuting in on this music conference, which I think most of us can agree on. And again, Sarah, I think it's where things get mushy. I think most of us can agree upon women and children. Like, concert shouldn't be a place for this. But then where do you draw that line?
Seniors who are in wheelchairs.
Yeah, but if you cut off the Gaza Strip and mothers can't afford to feed their babies or have no way of feeding their babies because you've completely cut off the Gaza Strip, isn't that also killing babies? And I think it gets really, really tricky to it's not like a clear line. It's not a game of Battleship or whatnot where you can be very clear, chess, right? Where you're very clear about, I'm taking this pawn, but not this pawn or whatnot. Yeah. And so these statements about BLM, what I keep thinking about is in the early days of BLM and BLM-LA, when they were doing things like closing down the freeway. That was what I read as by any means necessary. Is it against the law? Yes. Is it inconvenient for a lot of people? Sure. Is it deadly? Maybe, right? If someone needs to get to the hospital and they cannot get on the freeway. But I think that is very, very, very different from parachuting in on a concert. And I would love to, if it would be possible, and I don't know that it is in this world and this climate, if there could be a real calm conversation between some of the Jewish leaders here in our region and some of the folks from BLM-LA to say, like, where can we find common ground? Do when you see this footage, does this seem okay to you? What would it feel like if your kid was at Coachella and someone came down from the sky, right? Like, ooh, these are the difficult questions that I wish we could have civilly. I'm not sure that we can.
And to that point, though, Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, said today specifically about this infographic of the hang glider with the Palestinian flag saying, "We stand with Palestine," that these are fringe groups, he said, is anti-Semitic, dehumanizing, and could prompt violence. Similarly, Bernie Sanders, AOC, long seen as some of the national leadership of the Democratic Socialists of America, have come out with very nuanced statements. They have called out DSA and the protest and rally that happened in New York City last week, saying this goes way beyond what we are supporting as a nation.
Yeah. But going back to Nithya for a moment, because I did find her exact statement, and she said, I found the statement put out by the National DSA, and then she said, an organization that's endorsed me failed to reckon with the horrors committed by Hamas and was unacceptably devoid of empathy for communities in Israel and at home who are living in fear and mourning. And the other thing that she said was that in issuing a short statement on Saturday in support of families in my district who were scared for their loved ones in Israel, I myself failed to acknowledge the deaths of Palestinian civilians. And that's bold and brave. And Scott Wiener today, State Senator Scott Wiener in San Francisco said, this is what I really like about Nithya, is that she's not afraid to wade into it and say, like, here's where I might have made a misstep. And she is up for re-election. One of her opponents, Ethan Weaver, apparently put out multiple statements, as Nithya said, using my endorsement by DSA to declare me as a supporter of terrorism. Flyers have been distributed in my community labeling me as a supporter of Hamas. And again, right, like, is the combustion there of making an equation that I don't know, right? Just because Nithya hasn't put out a statement, just because she's been endorsed by DSA, does not mean that she is a supporter of Hamas. Yeah. So it gets super ugly super quickly. Meanwhile, we should note that when this episode goes to air, it'll be Friday the 13th. There are some in the world of Hamas declaring it as a day to come out in support to protest, calling in some instances for violence. That has put local authorities on guard. We've seen Santa Monica Police, LAPD, LA sheriffs standing up saying that they're aware of recent statements, calling for action. They're doing check-ins on, think of in Southern California, how many synagogues, Jewish schools. They say they're also checking in on mosques, and I hope that can start to be some semblance of we are looking out for everyone in our community.
Right.
Sara, what I'm curious to get your opinion on too is because another local angle to all of this is how it's playing out at local universities. Of course, we've seen some folks at Harvard and back east speaking out in support of Palestine and Hamas, and that's really ruffled some feathers. And then there's been local protests here as well. The La Fuerza Student Association at Cal State Long Beach and CSU Students United Against Apartheid held a day of resistance. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, right? And I actually had a conversation with one of my classes yesterday, and we read an article from the New York Times about the controversy at Harvard, and had some conversations about it. And it was really fascinating to hear the students' take. And I think there's a lot of confusion for a lot of students as well. These are students today who were born after 9/11. They haven't necessarily lived through the unrest in the Middle East in the ways that, like you described, from the 1970s, and seeing this continuously play out. So they acknowledge that there's a lot of information that they still need. They felt in general that the statements from colleges and universities aren't terribly helpful. And also recognized really the real right of students to make statements if they feel the need to do so, right? Because of the complexities of this situation. And I think that's pretty right on. We've seen this, however, also playing out in some other local universities where comments have specifically been made.
And I think it gets really tough. How do you balance that freedom of expression with also the students need to feel safe on campus? As mentioned, there was this demonstration in Long Beach, and right after that happened, I had the opportunity to speak with Democratic Congressmember Robert Garcia, who represents that district, of course, former mayor of Long Beach, and he talked about what we've been talking about, right? You have to separate Hamas from the Palestinian people. You have to have empathy for the deaths and harms of any human beings. But, when it comes to demonstrations on campuses, it can get a little complicated. Here's what he told me.
I think it was very inappropriate what those students were doing, especially in light of the moment in which we should be thinking about the pain and suffering that is happening right now in Israel and the region. I also understand, as the university understands, that people and students have a right to free speech. And I, violently disagree with most of what they were saying, all of what they were saying, but they have a right to do so. And that's one of the hallmarks of this country. And so as long as it's being done in a way that's peaceful, a lot of those students have a lot to learn about humanity and about the moment that we're in. But the university, like any university, has free speech laws, and I think that's an important part of what our country's about.
And Sara, I have to say it first, this week, what the situation in the Middle East has done is in some ways shadowed an issue I think we'd be talking about a lot more otherwise this week, which is that Monday marked the year anniversary of the leaked racist recording between Gil Cedillo, Kevin De Leon, and Nuri Martinez and Ron Herrera. It's been a year. And, we in the media and everybody like to do that. It's been a year. Let's talk about it thing. And
100 days, 1 year.
Right. We love those things. But I actually talked with Mike Bonin about this, like on the cusp on October 9th Eve. And I said to him, Mike, I don't mean to get all woo-woo on you, but I know when I look back at very significant and oftentimes turbulent or traumatic parts of my life, my body, I'm going to sound like the biggest new age hippie, but I feel it when it's a year, right? Because there's those cues that start coming it's fall and the leaves are turning or whatever. And this reminds me of a year, pumpkin spice lattes start coming up. And then you remember, and then this news.
Pumpkin spice lattes. recorded
conversations,
leaked
like
recordings.
Those things
Yes.
will always be linked. So it's been a year. I talked to Mike Bonin, who was pretty angry about what he and many others have called the apology tour of the three members that are involved. Of course, LAist has a podcast called Imperfect Paradise, and they have been talking about the fact that they're the first media outlet to talk with Nuri Martinez since the tapes came out. She kind of went into hiding for a while. They reached out to her. She thought about it for a long, long time, finally agreed to do it. And it's been very interesting. In the episode that dropped this week, she talked about what it was like for her, like when she found out that the tapes had come out and the immediate aftermath. And she talked about the fact that she was unclear about how big it would blow up. Karen Bass, who was a mayoral Congress member and mayoral candidate, Karen Bass, saying, who
was there allegedly when that conversation happened at the MLK Day parade.
Yeah. So had deep ties to it. According to Nuri Martinez, Karen Bass is a different version of this apparently, that Karen Bass thought it might blow over quickly and said, don't worry about Biden was coming to town and doing
You'll
a
still be
Latino
there.
fundraiser, right? However, Nuri Martinez describes very early in the morning, curled up on the bathroom floor and having a phone conversation with Alex Padilla. And if you listen to Imperfect Paradise, what Nuri seemed to convey was that Alex Padilla was being so hard on her, and she kept trying to say, it's me, you know me, I'm not this person. So, just so happens, Alex Padilla and I had the chance to speak on Monday, October 9th, the year, and I hate the word anniversary in this because I like to think of anniversaries being like marriages and happy things. But I asked him about this and said, how do you remember that conversation and why did you make the choice? Because Alex Padilla, as a U.S. Senator, came out and said, all three of you have got to go. Here's the senator's recollection of that conversation.
In some ways, it was tough because I have known Nuri. We went to high school together. We grew up in the same community, and we both sort of committed to a life of public service and government and politics in response to Proposition 187. We worked on campaigns together, those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, it was pretty straightforward. When I heard segments of those leaked tapes, I knew it was wrong, fundamentally wrong. Did have some initial conversations with her privately, telling her what I thought, trying to listen to see what her explanation or justification or how she would respond to the scenario. But from Sunday, a couple conversations, to Monday, I just felt it had reached beyond a certain point. And for me personally, how I could hear something like that from somebody I knew well personally and not condemn it, yet go back to Washington and hear from some of the rhetoric from my Republican colleagues and condemn that. You have to be consistent with your values. And if I was going to be consistent, then as well as I knew Nuri as far back as we had gone back, what's right is right, what's wrong is wrong, and she needed to step down along with Gil Cedillo, Kevin De Leon, and we've seen what's transpired this last year.
Senator, I want to...
Let me just add one more thing. Not only was it important, I think, for me to speak out because of our values and what we stand for, but I truly feared that the attention and response to what we heard in those tapes would actually take away, distract, or undermine the work that had been done for decades in Los Angeles. The African-American community, the Latino community, not working against each other, but working together, those relationships, those proverbial bridges that had been built. I knew those relationships and those bridges were strong, and I was encouraged by the amount of sort of back channel, if you will, conversations, phone calls, coffees that were had, leaders in both communities saying, we can't let one incident, this tape, undermine everything that we have going on for the good of our communities from an economic development standpoint, public safety standpoint, education standpoint, access to healthcare standpoint, et cetera. So I think our relationships, our bridges have proven to be resilient. We've withstood the crisis of the leaked tapes. And I think that shows the strength, the maturity, and the resilience of our relationships.
And again, combustible, right?
Yeah.
It was such a and much like
the whole tapes were it was
Right.
combustion across the city of Los Angeles.
and it's wild. I mean, who would ever think that we could make a comparison between the situation in the Middle East and the leaked racist recordings? But I actually
I'm
think there's
cringing a little just thinking about it.
right,
yeah.
but there actually, in some ways, I think,
Yeah.
is a lot more there than you would think. And this notion of you had to take a stand. Were you with, Nuri and Gil and Kevin, or were you against them? They had to make a choice. Do you step down immediately like Nuri Martinez did, or do you stay in office and still stay in office today like Kevin De Leon does?
Well, I think even just the piece you had mentioned earlier with Nithya, kind of having that nuance, recognizing some of the shortcomings of the DSA statement. It is an interesting thing. Like there seems to never be any opportunity to actually just apologize for these four folks, right? I mean, the LA Times had written a piece covering Kevin De Leon in particular this past weekend, looking at the work that he has done. He did his whole apology tour. He went away for several months. He's done a whole lot of outreach to the Black community, it seems, with, we've talked about it previous episodes where he had a monument put in place in downtown Los Angeles and was really joined by the Black community. Earlier, he had taken a bus of Black business leaders to Tijuana for those cross-border conversations.
But as Cerise Castle noted, was there a single Black person who worked on the podcast? Did they get that perspective on the LAist podcast?
I don't know the answer
to that.
I don't know the answer to that.
But it's so hard in all of these situations. Are you really getting everyone's perspective?
Right.
And I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know the answers to that. But I do think it's an interesting piece. Like, is there ever anything that one can do to redeem themselves, to grow, to move forward? I think one of the things I really appreciated about the podcast this week was actually looking at the redistricting and kind of the politics side.
You were interested in the redistricting part of it, Sarah. This might be the only bright, humorous moment of this week's episode. Of course
I was.
Redistricting nerd. Okay, so what do you see on that front?
Well, and I've said this before, and I will say it again. On the redistricting side of this conversation, these are not issues that are going to go away. I saw the same
fighting over properties and assets.
And the legitimate fight for representation and what representation means, what it means today in 2023 and what it's going to mean in 2030 and 2040 and 2050 as we become a more and more multiracial society. We don't have the institutions to handle that, quite frankly. And I saw this at the Redistricting Commission. So this back and forth that we see on, in those tapes about redistricting, folks, we saw the same thing between Black, Latino, Asian Americans. I'm even going to throw in LGBTQ folks as well, all making very legitimate claims for representation in a game that is zero-sum with a Voting Rights Act that was not written or prepared for a multiracial time period. And those problems are not going to go away. We can point to the issues, we can point to how that makes us feel uncomfortable, but we have to continue to have that conversation because it happened at the state level as well.
Yeah.
It was not easy drawing Los Angeles. The difference was that it happened publicly. And we heard that fight, and the commission was left in a place to try and navigate the waters between communities that were not on the same page. And even if we put a commission in place in the city of Los Angeles, they're going to be put in that same position as well.
Well, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that we've been learning through the Imperfect Paradise podcast is, I think everybody was so hot and combustible over what did they say about Mike Bonin's son and what did they say about Armenians and what did they, all of that. But the nuance of, okay, where did things get so tense between Nuri and Mike Bonin? Because they actually had worked together on a lot of things. And the recollection, Mike describes the power struggle that was kind of going on between Nuri and Marquise and who was going to be the next council president. And again, we see those Black and brown dynamics, which are incredibly difficult.
Right.
No one wants to give up any power because most people of color have so little of it to begin with. And I completely feel for that and empathize rather with that.
And, and I think the other piece that they got into in the podcast, and I was really glad that they did, was this sense of envy of these Latino leaders towards Black power. Not so much dilution, but actually envy towards the Black political power that the Black community has built. And I think that is something, absolutely, from a political science standpoint, that is something that we see, we measure, right? Like the Black community has had this long history. Marquise Harris Dawson was interviewed in the podcast talking about how we've been out there registering folks to vote since the 60s, right? And that is true.
And yet the numbers population-wise
and the population
have dwindled.
is shifting. And that is a very real consideration that has to be taken. We have to further unpack what that means.
And no easy answers.
And there's no easy answers. That has all sorts of implications for who's going to be elected, especially if we continue in these single-member districts where you only get one. It becomes incredibly hot under the collar. And we certainly saw that at the state level as well.
One more thing that I'm really hoping that at some point somehow there can be more attention and more unpacking of as well, that I've learned from these interviews with Nury Martinez, is the gender part of all of this. There was one part where she was talking about buying ties for all the men on the city council and like her sense of fashion and looking around. And it kind of reminded me, remember Anna Guerrero, who worked with Eric Garcetti, and she used to love like the power zoot suits. Like there's a similarity with her and Nury Martinez with their love of fashion and fashion as a sense of power. And the fact that, you know, that Nury looked at these men and talking about her Doc Marten boots, which was the first part. And I really think there's something there. And I know I'm not maybe doing the best job of articulating it, but I know as a woman, I've been in a situation where maybe I'm the only woman in the room, and all the men are like talking about themselves. And I don't know about you, Sarah, like, and I don't like that I do this, but in the past I've done it where the men are all like, blah, 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 and I kind of overcompensate that myself to show like
dropping F-bombs left and right.
Right. Well, I do that in all sorts of company, but that sense of like, I don't have a pair of balls, but look at this, boys. And when I heard that tape, I heard so much of that from Nury Martinez. And Nury, I don't know if you're listening, but, you know, that's the conversation I would really love to have with her about that sense of gender and power and how much that weighs in. And when you're in a room with those three guys, did she consciously or not kind of overcompensate? Doesn't justify say it loud and clear. It does not justify any of the things that were said. But sometimes I think when you try to figure out what that apology is, it's not just about saying you're sorry. It's about figuring out why, which she has also talked about, like how the word changuito was used so often in her household, that little monkey term, and how her mom used to use it and how it might mean something totally different to her spoken than it does when, millions
translated
of people pick
into
up
English.
the LA Times in print, right? Little monkey to describe a black boy is horrific.
Right. No, agreed. And I want to thread one last needle before we move on to this, right? So this week, of course, BLM was back in city council, bringing the heat about the 1 year since these tapes.
They're outside of
Kevin DeLeon's house. And I can't stop but see a little bit of irony here, right? When bringing it back to our earlier conversation about, this support for Palestine, the hang glider. Look, I get it that there's a lot of tempers around this comment toward Mike Bonnen's son. But at the same time, the irony of condoning this Hamas attack in Israel on civilians, including children, it is not lost on me. I find that a really tough needle to thread. That there's this one child so aggrieved, and yet it's okay to bring not just comments, but physical violence and death on others. I cannot stop but to see the irony in those statements, and definitely something I'm thinking a whole lot about.
Well, I'm thinking about I'm going to throw this out one. Does the name Joe Breali mean anything to you?
No, tell me.
He was the political outsider. He was kind of like the like Eunices Hugo Soto Martinez guy. He's a bicycle activist. He was in Gil Cedillo's district. He challenged Gil Cedillo when he was up for re-election. And for a while, there was this incredible groundswell of support for Breali. Everybody loved this guy, and a lot of people who didn't like Gil Cedillo was like, here's finally the guy who's going to get Gil Cedillo out of office. And it was phenomenal. And then just to see how much power he was gaining, and then these old tweets and YouTube posts started coming out. Bradley had done a video with Gustavo Arellano for his Ask a Mexican, and it was all about how Mexicans were so loud and blah, blah, blah. And, Joe Bradley was married to a Mexican woman, so there was this kind of one familiarity with it. There's one way of looking at it. He made remarks about fat people. There were, sizes. There was all this basically they were basically kind of a different version of everything that came out on that leaked recording with Gil Cedillo. And once that came out, his campaign was over. He didn't step down. I mean, I talked with the guy on election night. He was holding out hope, but it didn't happen, and his life was totally ruined. To go through that, only to then find out that the person who did get reelected had said all of these things. And this week, Gil Cedillo came out and did his first interview in which he said, I didn't say anything racist. How can you say I was part of a racist conversation? Where's the racism? Where's the N-word? There's no racism. History is a real fascinating thing when you get the long view.
Sure is.
Last but not least, we want to talk about one of the Californians in the race to become president, RFK Jr. We've talked about him here before. This week, he has said he will now be running for president as an independent. Yeah. He's miffed that Joe Biden will not debate him, and so off he goes.
Yes.
What do you think?
Like a couple weeks, a month ago, something like that, you had told me, we got to cover RFK. And I thought, why? He doesn't have any chance. As an independent, I don't think he has any chance of winning the race, but he most certainly has a huge chance of pulling people away from both Biden and Trump. He has this very strange sort of appeal to a little bit of both Republicans and Democrats.
And no party preference.
Party preference, truly. I am so curious to see how this all plays out, because there are, polling has always shown there are contingents of Democrats who say, I'm not comfortable with Biden. There are Republicans who say, I'm not comfortable with Trump. By all measures, it looks like it will come back to a Biden-Trump election. Where do those defectors go? Someone like an RFK becomes a home for them. He had his campaign launch just this week as an independent, had a whole bunch of supporters out there. I think this is a really fascinating development and actually could, combust the presidential
Bringing
race.
it back home. We'd love your thoughts on RFK, on the situation in the Middle East, on the year on, I won't say anniversary of these tapes. Let us know what you think. I'm at social media at Alex Cohen in LA.
And I'm at Sara Sadhwani.
And we'll see you here next week. The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Nathaniel Leathers is our editor. The executive in charge of production is Jeff Shore.